In the previous part of this video series I covered making this form which is in the shape of a mask. In this video I'm going to cover making a mould and casting up the mask. So what I'm doing here is to cut out some foam board to the correct shape, and I'm creating a surround around the form that I've created. What this is going to do is to give me a nice smooth edge to the mould, and it's also going to stop the silicone running off the form as I rotate it about to try and cover the whole thing with silicone. One thing I've also done here is to give it a coat of a wax release agent. The reason I've done this is because I've spray painted the form with grey primer, and I've previously found that some types of silicone can stick to this, so just in case I've given it a release agent so that there won't be any problems putting the mould off the form. So here we go with the first layer of silicone, and what I'm doing is to pour it over the form, and then I'm going to rotate it about to make sure that I get complete coverage. I'm slightly worried about the eyes here. I think that because there's a fair bit of detail here, there is potential for air bubbles, so I'm just being very careful to make sure that the silicone gets into all of the details in the eyes. This first batch of silicone is slightly over catalysed, so it cures quite quickly. So what I want to be able to do is to rotate the form around, get the silicone to completely cover it, but for it to dry pretty quickly so that I don't have to keep rotating the mould for hours and hours. As you can see here, I'm just using a tongue depressor to scoop up some of the silicone that's got into the channel at the side there, and I'm just reintroducing onto the top. The level of catalyst I've put into the silicone here says that it should cure in about 3 to 4 minutes, so I'm anticipating that this will slowly stop flowing as it cures. Now that I've got the first layer of silicone on there, which is effectively a detail layer to pick up all the details of the form, I'm now coming in with a slightly thicker version of the silicone. This is the same silicone, but I've added a thixotropic agent to it, which makes it a bit more putty-like, and I'm just adding this on now to build up the thickness of the mould. The last thing you want is to pull the mould off and for it to either be too thin and for it to tear, or for it to be deformed in some way. So getting a good thickness on the mould is very important. So now that that layer is dry, what I now need to do is add some keys onto the outside of the mask. What I've done is to pour some silicone into this box here, and I'm going to cut it up into smaller sections. What these are going to do is to allow some registration points. Because the mould's made of silicone and it will deform if I put it straight off the form, what I need is a hard rigid jacket around the outside to hold it in place. So these keys are going to allow the jacket to align exactly with the mould itself, and I'm just going to attach them to the mould with some more silicone. So now that I've got those on there, I can now start adding fiberglass around the outside of the mould to give it a hard rigid case to hold it all in shape. You can probably see here that what I've done is to create a divide down the centre, and I've just done that with some cardboard and some aluminium tape. That's just going to create a divide between the two halves of the mould. If I couldn't pull the outside jacket apart, there's a potential for the mould locking together and me not being able to get the mask out once I'm done. So having a separation in the centre allows me to put some bolts through, and so the two halves of the jacket can come apart, and that will just mean the mould can easily be pulled off the form. I've mentioned fiberglass before. It consists of this glass fibre chopped strand mat that you can see on the desk there. What you do is you laminate it together with some polyester resin, and you basically just paste it on. Once it dries, it becomes very rigid, so it's very useful for creating very strong but very thin shapes. Right, so here's my mould jacket that I'm now prying apart with a screwdriver. One tip is if you don't want the two halves of the fiberglass mould to stick together, add some Vaseline around one edge once it's dried. That will stop the two halves sticking together, and then you can prise it apart like I'm doing now. You do need to be quite careful with fiberglass, although it's very strong. You can get some very nasty fiberglass splinters, so it's a good idea to have a go at it with some sandpaper before you start handling it. So I can now pull the mould itself off my form. So it doesn't look too bad. I can't see any obvious air bubbles, which is always nice. One thing I was worrying about is the edges of the mould, but they seem to have come out quite cleanly as well. I think I do have a little bit of an air bubble in one of the eyes, but I don't think that's going to be a problem. So the last thing to do is just clean up the edges with some scissors. Right, and there's my mould. So as you can see, I've bolted the two halves together, so that's ready to have some material cast into it. So now I've got my mould, I can start casting up some copies. Now, I decided to have an initial go with this before I did anything on camera. And what I decided to do is to use some polyurethane resin to effectively rotocast. Now what that means is that you pour a small amount of resin into the mould and you rotate the mould around. Now this particular type of polyurethane resin I did know wasn't really suitable for rotocasting, and they say as much on the manufacturer's website. Nevertheless, I thought it might be interesting, so what I did was give it a layer of fiberglass on the inside just to give it some structural strength. Then I pulled it out. As you can see, the outside of this is a little bit flaky, and it actually struck me straight away that this looks a little bit like pitted and rusted metal. So I immediately started thinking, well, I could add some rust pigments to that and develop it into something else. So I did. So this is what it actually is currently looking like. I'm developing this into a sort of a robot sculpture. I'm actually quite liking the look of that, so that's sort of become a separate project away from this, but that was sort of a happy accident, if you will. Now these are the other casts that I've done. As you can see, they're looking a little bit more decent. So the way I did this was to use fiberglass again. So what I've got here is two types of glass fibre. I've got glass fibre tissue and light chop strand mat. So they're just two different grades basically. So what I'm doing is I've mixed up some polyester resin and I've put a black pigment in it. I'm going to put a thin layer of glass tissue down first, and I'm primarily concentrating on the eyes. Because the eyes have got a fair amount of detail here, I've got to be quite careful not to introduce air bubbles as I do this. Once I've got a layer of glass fibre tissue down, so effectively a detail layer, I can then come in afterwards and back that with the thicker chop strand mat. I must say I do like it when it's raining in the workshop when I'm working, so you get that really lovely pattering sound on the roof, which is really atmospheric. So this is just a question of slowly building this up in layers. I'm not quite sure how easy it is to see what's going on here, but hopefully you get the idea of building up the layers as we go. So now that I've got the majority of the first layer down, I'm now coming in with the heavier chop strand mat, and I can put that on in larger sections because it's really there just to give it a bit of strength. So it's just a question of slowly building this up in layers until you get something nice and thick, and that should be quite strong. So I've now left that for an hour or so, so I'm just cracking the mould open. And there's my first cast. Now a bit of cleanup around the edges is required, and I can see a few little imperfections in the front, but overall I'm pretty pleased with that. If you watched my previous Steampunk Mask build series, you'll know that I spent quite a lot of time trying to figure out how to get ventilation into the mask. What I eventually found out was it's much easier to suck air out of the mask rather than to blow air into it. So I'm going to try and do the same thing here for this mask, but in this case what I want to do is actually build the fans into the mask itself. On my previous version it was a separate unit that I carried on my back, and that worked well enough, but I quite like the idea of this being one self-contained unit. So what I've got is some computer fans, and I'm going to cut the central piece out of that. For the previous mask, what I used as a housing was the central cardboard roll from some rolls of masking tape. Now, I had bought this metal pipe from eBay which I thought might be the right size, but it's just slightly too thin, which is a bit annoying, so I'm going to go with rolls of masking tape again. And as you can see here, these fit in exactly, so that's really handy. So what I'm going to do is cover them in styrene so they look like they're plastic, and what I need to do is to embed these in the mask. So I need to cut a space into the mask to allow that to happen. So I've marked out an area and I'm now cutting that out with the Dremel. So hopefully you can see how that's going to sit in the mask. The idea is that there's going to be channels in the top of the mask, on top of my head, that will allow the air to flow through the mask. So now this isn't particularly pretty at all, but what I've done here is to use a thermoplastic called Kydex, and that's something that's quite easy to shape once you heat it up. What I've done is to put that on the interior of the mask and to have heat formed it simply by using a heat gun and a pair of gloves to sort of press it into shape. Like I say, it's not particularly pretty, but it does seem to work, so what I now need to do is replicate this on the other side as well. And that looks like that. So a bit of a mess, but it is at least functional, so that's good. What I've also got here is a piece of aluminium strip which I've bent to shape, and that's going to sit over my head to hold the lower part of the mask in place. Now I've created the lower part of the mask in exactly the same way as the other part. I just made a mould and I've built that up with fiberglass. So as you can see, I've attached the loop of aluminium to it, and that's holding the earpieces and the lower part of the mask together. So here's the mask in a sort of a halfway finished form here. I've got my air intakes installed. If I take the top half of the mask off here, you can see how that's held together. I've just got a few pieces of aluminium which are going to be joined together by some bolts. What I've also done is to put a piece of aluminium on the front of the top half of the mask, and as you can see that loops in on the bottom there to hold it all together. As you can see, I've also done a fair bit of filling and sanding to make sure all these elements fit together correctly. So the next step for this is to give it some paint, and also to add a variety of steampunk gizmos and gadgets to really bring this to life. But for the time being, that's it for this part of the video, so thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Thanks very much for watching. I'll be posting more videos on this project and others, so if you'd like to keep up with what's going on, please do subscribe. Alternatively, you can visit my website, which is www.thedarkpower.com, or you can find me on Facebook, just search for The Dark Power.